Najee Harris, a top 3 pick. We're here to break down the top 5 running back rankings starting right now on the Razzball Fantasy Football Podcast. Welcome back, folks, to another episode of the Razzball Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm your host, Bobby Lamarco. I'll be joined shortly by the Commander-in-Chief of the Razzball football side, Donkey Teeth, in just a moment. Before we do, we want to make sure you're following us across the board. We're actually on Razzball Fantasy YouTube channel streaming live most days of the week. So make sure you're following us at Razzball Fantasy. Subscribe, leave a comment, throw up a couple likes. We really would appreciate it. Make sure you're also going to the Razzball IG and also the Razzball TikTok account where we're posting daily content for baseball, basketball, hockey, and also football. And finally, make sure you're going to Razzball.com. Today, we're going to be breaking down the top 5 running back rankings for 2022 with Donkey Teeth, and he's about to post an article very shortly for this running back rankings. So make sure you're jumping on to Razzball.com to check out all the great rankings, all the great content we have on there for all sports. Now, let's bury the lead long enough. Let's bring in the man who we're going to be talking about his rankings today. It's Donkey Teeth. What's up, man?
Yo, what's happening, Bobby? Actually, the rankings, they're already up over there at Razzball.com. So, yeah, you can head over and check them out now. Excited for you to roast me here.
Yes, I felt so awkward having any controversial comments to DT. I told him pre-show, hey, man, listen, I just want to go let you know it's all love, but I am going to have some comments about your rankings. But I love it because it's not your traditional rankings. Yes, we're going to jump right into it in just a second. The one thing teaser I will give you is that the 5 players does match our top 5 consensus running backs on the Razzball ADP site. However, they're in a much different order, which I love from DT. So I think the most controversial might be number 5. So let's get into it. Going to 5 to 1, your top 5 running backs. Let's get into it.
So, yeah, McCaffrey, he's coming off of 2 seasons of injury. He's only played 10 games in the past 2 seasons. You know, these are, I should start by saying, Bobby, these are half PPR rankings. They're geared towards half PPR league. So we know McCaffrey, when he's on the field, he's got that upside of the number 1 overall player. There's no doubt about that. Yeah, I think he's being overdrafted maybe a little bit. You know, when I put these rankings together, I do not look at the consensus until after I've jotted some thoughts down on these guys. And I went and looked at McCaffrey, and I see he's going off the board number 2. A little bit surprising to me for a guy who's only played 10 games in the past 2 years after, you know, he didn't miss a game in his first 2 seasons. So durability is the reason I have him at 5. I didn't expect him to be going off the board at number 2. That was a little bit surprising to me. And it's more that I'm excited about the guys above him. I definitely could see McCaffrey being the number 1 player again. Don't get me wrong. These guys are all relatively close in my book, except for the man at number 1 who we'll get to. I think he's in a league of his own.
Now, first off, I want to say that McCaffrey, we all know it's basically weighing that injury risk versus his upside. We all know that McCaffrey, hands down when he's on the field, is probably the best player for fantasy football. He did play just 10 games the last 2 years. You're correct. He was 5th in points per game last year. The craziest part, he did that on only scoring 2 touchdowns last year. He was still 5th in points per game in those 7 games. That's how elite his usage is on this team. But I also want to look into his touchdown points. So touchdowns per touch. On average, his first 4 years, he averaged 5% of his touches were touchdowns. Last year, that was 1.5%. So if you just applied his career average to his touches from last year, his points per game would jump by 4.2. That would have been ahead of JT last year and number 2 just behind Derrick Henry. So that's why I think personally he's more closer to 2. But I totally understand being excited about these other running backs, and they're safer from an injury standpoint. So I totally get that. Let's jump down to number 4, DT. Who do you got?
So number 4 for me is Eckler. And, you know, like I said, these guys are pretty close. There was some movement in these rankings as I shuffled them around and really as I jotted down my pitches for each of them and why I had them in the slots, I inevitably ended up shifting them. So at one point I did have Eckler at 3. I don't think I ever had him at 2 in these rankings, but again, half PPR rankings. His floor is so high with his receiving ability. He's got a great young quarterback. their offensive line is on the rise here. I think if you're looking for just floor out of your first round pick in a PPR league, Eckler is a great pick. It's just not necessarily the way that I like to build my teams, because inherently running backs have injury risk. All of them have pretty high injury risk. Some have a little bit more coming off of an injury last year, like we're talking about with McCaffrey, but really there's no safe picks. These guys get their absolutely brutalized by, 250, 300 pound, just absolute monsters week in and week out. It's a tough job. It's hard to hold up for 16 games. So I think the idea of anybody being safe as a fantasy running back is a bit of a fallacy. So I don't tend to draft for that safety and that floor. I go for that home run swing, the Jonathan Taylor, and if they get hurt, they get hurt. We just can't really predict that kind of stuff.
Now, the thing with Eckler, his strongest suit might not even be him as a player, but what's around him, right? He's got a top 5 quarterback for fantasy in Justin Herbert. He's got a top 10 offensive line, according to PFF, who just drafted a first-round guard. So they have enhanced that offensive line. They've invested a lot into that offensive line. But Eckler was oddly dominant in the red zone last year versus his career averages. However, he was actually combined 34 points over expectation last year for red zone carries and inside the 5. So he converted at an insanely high rate. However, if you take away 34 points for him, he still is the RB3 last year, because him, JT, and Derrick Henry on a points per game basis were that much more of a difference versus guys like Leonard Fournette, Najee Harris, etc. Let's jump down to number 3 on the list. This one is probably, we already kind of gave it away at the opening of the show, but number 3 is the most interesting. Go into your number 3.
Yeah, as I said, I'm after the upside, and I don't know that there's anybody that has as high of upside as Najee Harris. He's right in that conversation talent-wise with everybody on that we're talking about today, but Jonathan Taylor, Christian McCaffrey. I think he's right there with them. There's some uncertainty, and I get why people are probably going to have an issue with this ranking, because their offensive line is trash. We don't know who their quarterback is. I mean, we talked about on our rookie show. I think it's going to be Trubisky. I think Tomlin is going to be able to get more out of Trubisky than the Bears ever did. So I guess I'm a little bit rose-colored on Trubisky there and the Steelers' offense as a whole. And their offensive line was so bad last year. Really, there's nowhere to go but up. Even just a little bit of improvement, I think, is going to go a long ways for Najee Harris. And again, he got the ball 307 times on the ground last year, 1,200 rushing yards as a rookie, 7 rushing touchdowns, 3 receiving touchdowns. He had 74 receptions. These are just absolutely massive numbers. The real question is how much is losing Roethlisberger going to hurt him? But I mean, that's such a great foundation for a rookie running back coming in, learning the offense. I'm pretty excited to see him in year 2. If those things can pan out, I got a lot of trust in Tomlin and his coaching staff, I guess, is what this ranking comes down to.
Now, I will say with Najee Harris last year, if you look at his opportunities, if you weigh them based on everyone having the same amount of points per opportunity, he would have been number 2 amongst running backs in points per game, right behind Derrick Henry. That's how elite his usage was. However, I will point out this. There was a huge difference in his production weeks 1 through 6 versus after the bye. Early on in the season, he averaged 7.7 targets per game, was up over 20 points per game in PPR. After the bye, his targets drops to 4.4. He drops all the way down to 16.3 points per game in PPR. That's RB10. And I do think that the Roethlisberger thing might be a little overrated. I think that, Big Ben, when he was targeting Najee, was fine. Najee led the NFL in targets and receptions last year amongst running backs. He also had the same reception percentage as Eckler, and he also had the same yards per reception as Fournette, the other 2 players notable over 80 targets, according to PFF. So I think that he's probably closer to that 6 to 8 range, in my opinion, but I don't mind the boldness because of those opportunities he does get. Let's jump it down to number 2. Who do you got number 2, DT?
Derrick Henry. He's coming off a foot injury. I think that's really the only knock that you can put on Derrick Henry. He's just been absolutely dominant for the past 3 seasons, just unstoppable. We know the Titans are going to give him the ball a lot as long as he is healthy. It sounds like he's pretty darn motivated this year. trying to prove the skeptics wrong. And I think that's something that you really, as an opponent, you don't want to see a motivated Derrick Henry. I kind of get this feeling that the back end of Derrick Henry's career is going to be a lot like Adrian Peterson's. I don't think there's very many running backs that you can put that. It's not fair to compare anybody to Adrian Peterson, really, but he's got that type of build. Everybody's been, kind of waiting for him to wear down because of that workload. And you could argue that did happen in 2021, but I kind of land more on the side of the fence that it was a freak foot injury. And, Adrian Peterson, he tore his ACL and he came back stronger than ever when he returned into his late 20s. So, Derrick Henry, 28 this year. I think there's still a couple of peak seasons left. Last year, he was on pace for 1,800 rushing yards and 20 touchdowns. So, it's hard not to have him this high, even in a half PPR league. In a standard league, he's right there with Jonathan Taylor for me. In half PPR, he's just a tier down.
Yeah, and listen, Derrick Henry was a complete animal the first 8 weeks of that season last year. Actually, more points per game than you see with JT in half and full PPR. Pro Football Doc did come out and say that he is primed for a breakout season, bounce back season. Because of that foot injury, he's not worried about it, so I'm not going to worry about it either. The other things that do worry me, though, Ryan Tannehill, what's the situation with him? Is Malik Willis going to have starts this year? The offensive line has slipped. The last few years after being in the top 10, has slipped to middle of the tier. They lost 2 starters in the offseason. So what does that look like going into this year? But I do believe the running back age thing. Last year on Razzball.com, we did an age analysis that we wrote about, and you should go check it out. Maybe I'll put it in the description. There you go, Bob. Just thought of a great idea. Throw it in the description because it talks about how running backs up and through age 30 season are really fine. They usually can still produce. We saw Melvin Gordon last year, age 28. But I did take a look at this further. 7 running backs had 250 carries at their age 27 season. They averaged 15.1 points per game. The very next season, it dropped by 3.5 points per game. The great news is for Derrick Henry, he would still average roughly 20 points per game in PPR, so he'd still be in the top 3. So I'm not worried about it at all, and that's why I think he's still at least a top 4 pick in my opinion. All right, let's go to number 1. Obviously, this one's easy, but let's get into it.
Yeah, so Jonathan Taylor, I mean, I've been a huge Jonathan Taylor fan ever since his draft season. Incredible talent. Obviously, last year was the breakout season, and I was pretty all in on him. It didn't look great at the start of the season. I was getting a lot of crap for ranking him. I actually had him at number 1 until that Quentin Nelson injury in the preseason or training camp, whenever that did happen, and I bumped Taylor down to number 2, but I still was really bullish on him, and he did not start the season well, but we all know how he finished it. He was a great buy low candidate there early, and I mean, I think that there could be a reason for slight concern. I like to highlight both sides of the argument. They're losing a couple starters on the offensive line, but they're still going to be one of the best offensive lines in the NFL, I believe. And, they're switching from Carson Wentz to Matt Ryan, which always adds a bit of uncertainty. I think most people would say Ryan is probably a slight upgrade, lateral, if nothing else. I've never been the biggest Matt Ryan fan, but Carson Wentz's shoes aren't like enormous to fill. So I think Taylor's going to be fine regardless. I have a hard time not picking him with the number 1 pick, as much as I do like to go against the grain.
Yeah, listen, I'll tell you right now, this is the only one in the top 5 that we have exactly the same. I agree with JT. The first one that bothers me is I have to clear the air. We have a podcast. I can say what I want on it, and I have a gripe to pick with everyone who keeps saying that he is the worst number 1 running back since 2015, Devonta Freeman, because it's all BS. If you look at weeks 1 through 5, they were showcasing Marlon Mack. Marlon Mack got plenty of touch. He had 25 carries in the first 6 weeks of the year. Week 6, why is that important? That's the week JT goes bananas and blows up. And they go, well, Marlon, sorry. They gave him 3 carries the rest of the year. So, yes, he was rotating. He only played 50% of the snaps, weeks 1 through 6. After that, it jumps to 80%. The guy goes from 16.9 points per game to 24. So what is 24 points? That's the same as Barkley was in 2018. That's on par with Kamara. That's on par with Dalvin Cook from a couple years ago. So this it's rubbish. It's all rubbish. Marlon Mack's not coming back, folks. JT is your safest bet at 101. Listen to the man. He had him at 2 last year. Come on, people. He knows what he's talking about. That's why I agree.
I think we lost Bobby. Bobby's frozen here. Well, I'll just go ahead and wrap up the show there, Bobby. Thanks for coming to the ranking show. I think next week we're going to cover number 6 through 10. Again, head over to Razzball. Check out my top 10 running backs. I think I'm going to dive in on the top 10 wide receivers with the next post, and then move on to quarterbacks and tight ends, and then circle back around for the next 10 or 20 running backs, something like that. So stay tuned for that. And until next time, go follow Razzball over on Twitter at Razzball. I'm DonkeyTeeth87. You can subscribe to this show over on YouTube at Razzball Fantasy, or just Razzball Fantasy. Bobby's out there on TikTok, Instagram, all that good stuff. We'll catch you guys next time.